So let's make a start on this. We're going to have a look at components of the CV system. So just parts of the CV system, really. So by C, we are talking about cardio. 1 second. By C, we're talking about cardio or cardiac. This relates to the heart aspects of this. And later on in the following tutorials, we're also going to concentrate on the V part. This V here refers to vascular. And by vascular, we are referring to the systems of the blood and the vessels, blood and blood vessels. So make sure you understand those constructs. It's going to help you longer term. Now then, with regard to the first bit, which is the cardiac bit, which I'm going to sort of develop within this individual tutorial, I want to introduce you to the heart. And you might think, well, James, come on. We don't really need that introduction. But look, let's make sure we get the primary concept here. This structure in our left chest, in our thoracic cavity, acts simply as a pump. Now, it does have some other peripheral roles, such as it contributes to temperature regulation, a couple of other things. But primarily, it is acting as a pump. And it's acting as a pump because this liquid here, the blood, is essential for transporting to all cells of the human body. So that's the job of this heart, really. So we need to get that kind of intuition clear in our minds. Now, a couple of things I'd like to address with you first of all is I'd like to introduce you to the atria. Atria. Now you might know the word atrium. Atrium, which is the singular of atria, which is the plural, atrium kind of means opening or entry point. So an atrium of a building is that first bit where you open the door and you walk in and there's like a big hallway area or a big space where the stairs and maybe the lift is, that kind of thing. That's an atrium. Okay, so the atria do the same job in the heart, and of course we've got the what is here, the right atrium over here, the right atrium, and they're what we call the openings of the heart. This is where blood returns when it comes back to the heart. We also describe these as the places that accept blood, so they accept blood. Okay, and the other point I'd make about the atria is that they also have thin walls. Now, by walls, I also want to address this point. Any mention of the word walls, we are talking about a muscle wall. And I'd like you to have an awareness that we would call this the myocardia, or the myocardium. That is any structure. Myo means muscle, cardium means of the heart. So the walls of the atria, for example, are really thin. We can see it again here. We've got this relatively thin muscular wall here, which surrounds, in this case, the left atrium over here. So we've got this thin wall structures. And you might want to think, well, why are those walls thin? Because all they need to do is pass blood downwards into the ventricles, which we're going to talk about in a moment. So the amount of force required for that is not all that significant. So let's move on to the ventricles. The ventricles. Make sure you get your spellings correct, please, folks. Let's move on to the ventricles. So, first of all, we'd refer to these as the lower chambers. In fact, I really should have addressed the fact that the atria were upper chambers, but they are the lower chambers of the heart. And what do? They pump out. Okay, so the responsibility of the ventricles is to pump. Why am I adding L's to everything? Is to pump blood out of the heart, and because of that, we find that the walls are thick. Remember that it's the myocardia that we're talking about with regard to these thick walls. So a great example here is the left ventricle, which let's call it this area here. This is the left ventricle as we look at someone's chest. We can see that the muscle wall is significantly thicker. Now, a couple of things we mention on here is that when this ventricle contracts, it's going to contract inwards like this. Okay, inwards and upwards. And that's because this blood is ultimately going to be passed through this valve here and up out of this big arced tube, which we're going to call the aorta a bit later on. Okay, so it's got to be nice and powerful to do that. So the left ventricles do that. I also want to introduce you to the concept of valves. Okay, valves of the cardiac system, or the cardiovascular system. So a couple I'd like you to be aware of. Well, first of all, a bit of an explanation about valves. They allow for movement in one direction, so they're what we call one-way valves. It's nice to think about it that way. The first ones I want to introduce you to are what we call the cuspid valves. the cuspid valves. Sometimes they call them mitral valves as well, but anyway, we're going to call them the cuspid valves. And what the cuspid valves do is they separate the atria. Let me just change colour. They separate the atria from the ventricles. So we've got a valve here, which is a cuspid valve. On the right-hand side of the heart, this is the tricuspid valve, and on the left-hand side, we've got the bicuspid valve. So these valves, and you see another one here, you see another one here. These valves operate between the left and the atria and the ventricles, so that blood can only flow downwards into the ventricles, not back into the atria. But I'd also like you to be aware of that we also have what we call semilunar valves. Semilunar valves, and these semilunar valves perform a similar function but at a different location. You see one here. This is the semilunar valve at the exit point out of this vessel, and this vessel here is what we call the pulmonary artery. So the semilunar valve here allows flow only through one direction through that valve. And you've got another one, I kind of drew over it over here, look, another semilunar valve there on the exit point into the aorta. Now, a couple of other quick things that I'd like you to have an awareness of. First of all, I'd like you to know that we have a feature of the heart called the SA node. So if we take this image here, the SA node might be pictured somewhere in this part of the heart, the upper to the right side of the upper heart. And the SA node is what we refer to as your pacemaker. Okay, pacemaker. Now this pacemaker sets the rhythm of impulse. Okay, so it's self-regulating also. We call it self-regulating. Sometimes we use the term myogenic, self-regulating. And what we mean by that is that this emits a signal, and this signal is actually this electrical impulse, actually what's going to stimulate atrial systole, or atrial contraction of the upper chambers, the atria. But we have a second node, which we're going to refer now as your AV node, and your AV node kind of does something similar, except it's positioned here. And this AV node effectively sends a signal like this around both ventricles, and it's this signal which is going to cause the ventricles to contract, or systole, what we call ventricular systole. So the AV node causes what we refer to as ventricular of the ventricles, ventricular systole. Systole means contraction phase, okay, ventricular systole. And the only other point I'd mention is that we need just to recall this concept of the myocardia, the myocardium. So all of that being said, what I'd like you guys to realize is that these are the key components of this cardiac system, and that's kind of the start of the components of the vascular system too. And in the next tutorial, we're going to have a look at both the blood and the blood vessels in a little bit more detail, so we can understand those constructions too, so we have a full understanding of these components. Good luck with the quiz, and I'll see you on the next one.